You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
It's the sound of your death.
We keep heaven packed with fresh souls.
The peak of your civilization.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity.
You're an errand boy.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, my beloved truth seekers, but it is here at Aeon Byte, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that Zion in cyberspace, where the spirit of East meets West through the GodAboveGod.com. We shy away from scholarly pontification and definitely shy away from New Age babble. We bring to you every week great blasphemy that, as Master Eckhart once wrote, is the true way to understanding God. We take no prisoners but liberate them.
I was going to the worst place in the world and I didn't even know it yet.
And yes, we are the Gnostics and the lovers of the esoterica. We are the lords of the now, the psychonauts that are daring the journey into the inner galaxies of our beings until we understand the map of the pleroma that resides there. And we are the perpetual shamans, magicians, and alchemists who love to share our ideas and art as much as we love to commune with the divine transcendental biology that lies high above creation, all the heavens, and all that is and isn't.
You ask me if I have a God complex? Let me tell you something. I am God.
And although we are having a bawling time exposing the ledger domains of Jehovah and his angelic mafia, we also understand that we've been deported into a lesser existence, a metaphysical Guantanamo Bay that we must not only escape but perhaps redeem. We must start with ourselves, and that knowing yourself that was written at the temple of Delphi of Apollo ages before any great master really figured this out. But how can we know ourselves when we basically wander one of those carnival mirror mazes most of our so-called aware moments? A carnival mirror maze crafted by Yaldabaoth in his eternal task of commandeering our light sparks as his booty by keeping us forgetful, anxious, and full of waking nightmares.
Perfect human world where none suffered, where everyone would be happy.
We wander our inner and outer lives, gazing at reflections that are warped versions of ourselves, believing that is who we truly are, and then are both shocked and accepting of the images. But the cockeyed mirrors are just black spells of our ego, projecting twisted reflections of indoctrination.
If I'm not me, who the hell am I?
Sure, in some of these mirrors we face every day and every moment of our lives, we may seem taller, stronger, comelier, or just funny enough to be the life of the party, but they are still forgery resemblances of who we really are. And we move on to the next mirror in disgust or joyful acceptance, quickly forget it although the residue remains in the back of our heads like a throbbing tumor, and on to the next image we deem as real.
People do it every day. They talk to themselves. They see themselves as they'd like to be.
Over and over again. And we continue to wander from imposter reflection to imposter reflection, feeling there are a million versions of ourselves, enough to make us crazy or just addicted to some substance if we're lucky. But if we're not lucky, we become so fragmented in time and space, we entertain little choice but to melt into the desires of the architect of the carnival, of the mirror mazes, and become his malleable slaves that have all but forgotten the one who first entered the labyrinth, or even truly stands before the mirrors of false perception.
All I've ever known to be true is a lie.
So what do we do, my beloved truth seekers? Nothing. Almost nothing. We close our eyes and open our chakras. We stand still, very still. We breathe. We remember who entered and who stands alone. in movement and in rest, as the Gnostic gospel says. We ground ourselves into the present and accept that our own responsibility is to be the watchman of nothing but our own innermost holy silence that allows both the symphony of the stream of life and the aeons to awaken us. And then we reject the partisan images, gaze down at our feet and the dusty path before them, follow the music, and leave this carnival mirror maze with a chuckle or two, perhaps calling for others to get out before it's too late for their sanity.
And what's this about a doctor's appointment? You're always going to the doctor.
I don't feel good.
So what? You think I feel good? Nobody feels good. After childhood, it's a fact of life. I feel rotten. So what? I don't let it bother me. I don't let it interfere with my job.
Easier said than done. But that's why it's a mystery, and that's why you must practice your mysteries, even when trapped in the labyrinth of mirrors, storming you with your many artificial selves, whether you like them or not, or the selves you have accepted in past, present, or future.
If you do not know the present, how can you claim to know the future?
You see, you, as sons and daughters of the virgin spirit of the Sethians, are so much more than a mere reflection. You are reality older than any reality. You are wanderers, passerbyers, like the Gospel of Thomas says, and your great tale is to walk out into the open, clean air of the naked truth with a recollection of what you, a creature of imagination, creativity, and hope, truly are. And at Aeon Byte, your host Abraxas attempts to aid you by dispelling the casinos of the demiurge.
God's so smart, like Jeopardy smart.
And I often put all the cards on the table, even if I, in my mortal incarnation of Miguel Connor, do not agree with them.
Is it true when you were born the doctor turned around and slapped your mother?
So on this approximately Saturday, February 14th, 2009, we return to the neo-Jewish Christian belief that Jesus was a revolutionary, sired a family, survived his death, and continued a royal line. But we don't bring you the scholarship, watered down like a tourist-trapped frozen margarita, we find in too many books today, my beloved truth seekers.
Jesus was born in North Africa. How come in paintings it always looks like he's one of the Bee Gees?
Our guest is an unbiased, erudite historian who takes the neo-Jewish Christian ideas and adds some very radical ideas with sound evidence. And radical is what we like here at the Virtual Alexandria, among us ever-debating Gnostics and lovers of the esoterica. We are the original and eternal coffee culture. We are the ones who love nothing more than sharing a pint of our discovered revelation in smoky, timeless taverns in their myriad manifestations.
My mind is aglow with whirling, transient nodes of thought, careening through a cosmic vapor of invention.
Ditto.
Our guest is Hugh Montgomery, author of The God Kings of Europe, The Descendants of Jesus Traced Through Davidic Dynasties, The God Kings of Outremer, and The God Kings of England. His theses and theories are like a psychic tsunami compared to the flimsy, Dan Brownish work you find out there. Hugh's trilogy basically points to the possibility that Jesus was actually an active, military noble from a family of established Davidic rulers in Palestine that controlled more than the Romans wanted. After his failed attempt to establish a Jewish state, he sired a line that later mixed with a royal line of god kings from ancient Babylon, who then became, unknown until now, many great rulers of Europe wishing their return to Jerusalem.
You said it, man. Nobody fucks with the Jesus.
In fact, for centuries, they succeeded in ruling Jerusalem during the Crusades with the aid of the Knight Templar. These god kings were also instrumental in nurturing and defending the Cathars, sparking the Protestant Reformation, and manipulating European history for centuries up until this day. We reveal the truth about these god kings and the vast and violent monarchy of Jesus, John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, Saul of Tarsus, James the Just, and many other figures that are mayhaps misrepresented in the Bible because they might have been actually power players of their days. You'll be startled at the evidence of these god kings, much of it coming from the own words of orthodoxy itself.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
And that's just scratching a whale's ass pimple, my beloved true seekers, even beyond the interview. His books offer a munificence of documentation, textual evidence, and a list of research lineages that would make Tolkien proud.
You can't handle the truth!
On this program, I certainly have taken my pot shots and drive-by polemics at such scholarly cads like Dan Brown, the authors of such books as Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Templar Revelations, Sylvia Browne and Her Manufactured History, and several others. But the truth is that Dan Brown did something oddly beneficial with the release of the Da Vinci Code. He tapped a nerve in both the Christian and Western consciousness. He offered alternatives to a static and sphinx-guarded history. He suggested that perhaps many Christians had been theologically fooled from the beginning, that there was so much more to early Christianity than we ever imagined, especially for those who never heard of the Nag Hammadi Library, the Church Father writings, or even the medieval heretics.
No more tricks, no more lies, only truth.
Dan Brown exposed that the subconscious of the spiritually minded Christian knew there was something more to the founding of the Roman Catholic Church, that Mary Magdalene, a lower manifestation of Sophia, deserved a higher pedestal in so many ways, and that brave men and women had been storing clandestine and wonderful secrets of spiritual deliverance for centuries. He brought to the surface the injustices done to the Cathars and the Blu-ray presence of the Gnostic Gospels themselves.
Let's go, on board, let's go.
So in a sense, even beyond his flapdoodle scholarship and sometimes blatant fabrications like the Priory of Sion, Brown gave a taste to the world of something greater and esoteric, and we haven't looked back since. Of course, a whole cottage industry has risen from his second book that weren't really his ideas, but existed in legend thousands of years before. And some of the works out there are of no better use than sumo wrestler toilet paper.
I'm the Lord Jesus Christ. Think I'll go get drunk and beat up some midgets. How about you, Diane?
But there are people like Hugh Montgomery who at least have sober propositions with sane research. It is up to you to take it or leave it, or if it sparks something within you, to, like I said before, just stop for a moment, look within yourself and away from the reflections you've become exposed to all of your life, and begin walking out of the carnival mirror maze of Jehovah we often call reality or the cosmos.
There's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
But enough of my drivel before you go on and kiss the bearded lady. Let us see what amazing surprises Hugh Montgomery has for us. This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us today we have the pleasure of having Hugh Montgomery. How are you doing today, Hugh?
I'm fine, thanks. And yourself?
Oh, I'm doing just great. Thank you very much for joining the show. Before we start on the God Kings of Outremer, could you give us a synopsis of the first two books of this trilogy and basically your thesis in general?
Okay. The first book is called The God Kings of Europe, and the second book is called The God Kings of England. And basically the first book deals with the Cathite dynasty of Babylon and its migration via Troy to Scandinavia, so that the whole of the three books go from roughly 1100 BC to 1100 AD, in other words about 2000 years, which in three fairly small books is a long period to cover. But I have concentrated on certain very small parts, if you like, of that history. And what happened is that around about 1100 BC, the Cathite dynasty, which was a dynasty of god kings, if you like, of Babylon, had something of a disaster. A plague, a hemorrhagic plague, swept through Mesopotamia. And because of the nature of god kingship, if you like, if the gods were no longer with you, you could no longer be king. So you had to sort of up sticks and go somewhere else. And this is basically what they did. And they moved up north past the Black Sea. We know that they went to Troy. We know that they moved up to parts of northern France. And we know that they finished up in Scandinavia. Now, we know that for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because they put up little graffiti on their way, like saying sort of Joe Bloggs is here. Well, they said, you know, the Cathite have been here at such and such a time during the reign of so-and-so. And one or two of those little stones that they put up have survived, one of which is in Aberdeen University Museum. But the other way that we know is because when this hemorrhagic plague swept through Mesopotamia, some of the members, if you like, of the Babylonian people at the time developed a mutation, an immunity to this hemorrhagic plague. And this has been given, the mutation has been given the name of CCR5 Delta 32. And although there are some places in Europe where you see little bits of this, the prime places where this today is still prevalent is southern Scandinavia and Iceland. And for example, the Icelandic saga in Lúðvík actually says, you know, these Sumerians were blessed by the gods. And the reason they were blessed by the gods is because they were immune to this particular hemorrhagic plague. So we can show that they went from place A and finished up in place B. There they became known as the Goths, or Goths, if you like, the gods. And they eventually came down into Europe and divided into two, and we call them the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. And it is with the Visigoths that we are particularly concerned, because one of the leaders of the Visigoths, a guy called Ataulf, married Maria of the Elchasites. Now, Maria of the Elchasites claimed descent from the Davidic line of Israel via Jesus. Book 2, which is called The God Kings of England, deals with the Viking invasions of northern France and England and finishes with the Norman invasion of England. But what we have to appreciate is that the Vikings, Visigoths, Mercians, etc., are all part of the same tribal groupings. And that as far as the Vikings or Danes, whatever you want to call them, were concerned, they were simply taking back land that they had owned previously. So they didn't regard it as an invasion, they regarded it as gaining back land that they already owned. And that's basically the sort of, you know, if you like, the outline of the first two books.
And, Hugh, what exactly is the Adamic royal line?
Well, good question. The Adamic royal line starts actually with the Cathite dynasty in Babylon, with a king called Adad-shuma-iddina, which is the Babylonian equivalent of Odin, or Ewan, or Woden, whatever you like to call him. And it simply means the one, by the way. It means the one, if you like, the one god or the one representative of God. And he was followed by Marduk-apla-iddina and Zababa-shuma-iddina. And over the process of sort of 600 years, when they moved up to Scandinavia, obviously these people became sort of deified, mythologized, and eventually they finished up with a one-eyed god with a big spear and a six-legged horse and what have you. But that's the mythology which came over 600 years or so. But the point about it is that the head, if you like, of whoever was the chief honcho was always called either Odin or was referred to as so-and-so the Odin god. And for example, one of the leaders of the Visigoths was called Rus Vungut, which simply means Rus the Odin god. In other words, it was a title. That's what it was. And therefore the Adamic dynasty claims descent from however many Odins you care to name. But amongst them there is one particular person who is usually known as Odin, but frankly I just think it was simply a title rather than being a particular person.
So, to wit, we have the Adamic royal line eventually merging with the Davidic royal line. Is that what happened?
More or less, yes. But I mean, there was several. Lots of peoples claimed descent from Odin. The Visigoths did, the Mercians did, the East Anglians did, the people of Kent did, and so on. All of these royal lines claimed descent from Odin. Now, whether they were or not, that's a different matter.
Coming to the thesis of your third book about the Jesus bloodline, what is some of the evidence or some of the most important ancient documents that lend credence to Jesus actually having a bloodline?
From the documents of the Inquisition at the time of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars, the Inquisition made quite clear that the Cathars had documents or a book or something of the sort in which they maintained Jesus had two wives, one of whom was Mary Magdalene. Now, the Cathars also had some fairly peculiar ideas, and they had this system of duality. So they didn't have just male and female as a sort of godhead, but they also had the idea of spiritual and human. And as far as they were concerned, there was two Jesuses, one of whom was totally spiritual, never came down to earth at all, and the other one who was purely human. Okay? So we have to understand that in order to understand where they're coming from. But this Jesus, as far as they were concerned, was married, had two wives, and had children. There's also, of course, what is known as the legend of Mary Magdalene, which in fact is not about Mary Magdalene, it's about Mary of Bethany, because in my opinion anyway, both of Jesus' wives happen to be called Mary, which makes life difficult. And we know that the legend of Mary Magdalene predates 1272, when Jacob of Genoa wrote the Golden Legend. Now, in my last book, The God Kings of Outremer, in the appendices, I've actually put the two legends side by side, so that you can actually see how the Golden Legend of Jacob of Genoa actually comes from a much earlier and simpler legend known as the legend of Mary Magdalene. There's also, of course, the Bethany document, which we can date pretty accurately from between 410 to 430. And that shows a Miriam, but we don't know which one, and Jesus having a daughter, who was also called Mary or Miriam. There's also a fragment of a genealogy which may or may not be part of the original Gospel of Matthew, but certainly it was presented at the Council of Nicaea. And this talks again about Jesus having two wives. Now, unfortunately, because it is a fragment, we are left we don't have some names there, and we're not quite sure who they are. But nonetheless, those documents show fairly closely that Jesus was married and had children. And then, of course, you get the Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Philip, which shows quite clearly he had at least one, and in my reading of it at least, he had 2 wives.
Yeah, can I interrupt you, Hugh?
Sure.
You do speak that there is an actual fragment of the Gospel of Philip outside the Nag Hammadi library?
No. The fragment I'm talking about is a fragment possibly of the Gospel of Matthew, the original Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Not Philip. No, this is, but I am not sure. My original thought, and certainly what I said in the first book, is that this came from the Gospel of Matthew. I am not sure that I would still go along with that. I think probably it is more likely to be a genealogy which was presented at the Council of Nicaea, and which they said, look, how can you say this guy is, a god? If he's a god, well, what about his children? What about his brother? Are they gods? Well, of course, there was no answer to it. And also, there's another document, at least some information, which was picked up by a Dr. Hugh Sinclair about 40 years ago, which also shows that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had a son. So there's quite a lot of evidence for, there being a descent from Jesus.
You also show evidence, even before that, the descendants of Jesus actually pled their case unsuccessfully to a certain Pope Sylvester, even before the Council of Nicaea, right?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, this is well documented. There's no question about that. I mean, it's documented by Eusebius, and it's documented by Malachi Martin, the great Jesuit professor of the Pontifical University. What you have to understand is that Sylvester was actually the first pope. Up until that point, he had merely been the Bishop of Rome, and the prime bishopric at that point had been Jerusalem, and tithes were paid to the bishopric in Jerusalem as being the, if you like, the mother church. There were 4 family bishoprics: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Ephesus. And each of those was designated for a particular descendant of one of Jesus's either sort of sons or nephews or what have you. Now, what happened is that when Constantine became emperor, he did a deal with Sylvester. Basically said, look, I will make you Pontifex Maximus, and that's actually the Latin title of the Pope. But it means nothing to do with Christianity at all. That was an old pagan title, the chief priest of the pagan Roman religions. Nothing to do with Christianity. And he said, I will give you the Lateran palace to live in, and will give you a stipend from the state, but in return for that, I need a religion which I can sell to the Roman people as the one and only religion. And that's what happened. And, they came to see him and said, look, this isn't good enough because, we are the descendants of Jesus and his brothers. You are nobody, basically. And there was an awful great argument. But because Sylvester now had the backing of the emperor, he turned around and said, well, I'm sorry, in future, Rome is going to be the head bishopric. I am going to be the Pontifex Maximus, the Pope. And your legacy, your descendants of Jesus and his brothers, is going to be written out in the Gospels. And that's, that is actually documented evidence. There's no question about it.
And Hugh, can you tell us a little bit, you talk about the lands being divided with the descendants of Jesus and so forth. Does this have to do with, it seems a little convoluted between, you write about the Nabateans, the Sabbateans, and the Abadias and Petra dynasty. Were these different segments of the Jesus dynasty?
No. Abdias was the name which was taken upon being made the first Judaic bishop of Babylon by a guy whose original name was Obadas, or Obadiah, and was a member of the Petrine royal family, or the Nabatean royal family. The important thing about him is that in the prologue to his manuscript, the person who was doing the translation, which is attributed to Julius Africanus, but probably almost certainly wasn't, but was possibly one of his scribes, says he was related to the Lord. Now the problem is he doesn't say how he was related. I wish he had. It would have made life an awful lot easier, but he didn't. Now, as we know that Abdias was part of the Petrine royal dynasty, but there is no suggestion anywhere at all that Jesus' family were members of the Petrine royal dynasty, one has to make an assumption, and this is an assumption I have made, that the relationship was by way of marriage. And I believe that Mary Magdalene was a member of the Petrine royal dynasty, and that Abdias was either a cousin or a nephew or something of that sort, and that was his relationship with Jesus. The important thing, from my point of view, is that because he was related to Jesus, he, more than anyone else, more than any other document that's been written, knew who Jesus' family was. And from him, we get the names of Jesus' full and half-brothers. So from him we get that Jesus had a twin called Judas, who's known as Judas Thomas, which simply means Judas the twin. He had another full brother called James, and Abdias makes it very clear that they are the sons of Joseph by Mary per carnem, by way of the flesh. In other words, perfectly normal conception, no Holy Ghost. Joseph also had another wife called Hannah, or Channa, and by her he had Simon, who's known as Simon Cananeus, or sometimes Simon the Petrine, which again suggests this Petrine connection. Judas, another Judas, or sometimes called Judah, who is known as Zelotes, and a guy called Thaddeus. And from the Gospel of Philip, we learn that he had a sister called Mary, and from other sources that probably two other sisters called Joanne and Salome. So we have a pretty good idea of, what Jesus' family was.
And Hugh, you mentioned that Mary Magdalene is actually the daughter of John the Baptist, right?
I believe so. Well, I'm sorry. I shouldn't use the word belief. Belief is something one should use for religion, not for, right. Not for historical record. The evidence that I have got suggests to me that John the Baptist's wife, Anya, who is well documented, by the way, was a member of the Petrine royal dynasty. And there is even a love poem from John to her, in which he calls her my Pearl of Petra. I think that John and Anya had a daughter, Mary Magdalene, who married Jesus. And I also, it is quite clear, in fact, if you have a look at the evidence, that John was at least 14 years older than Jesus, not sort of 6 months older. And there's all sorts of reasons for it, which, I go into my book in some detail, and it would take probably another hour to go to explain it all. But almost certainly, John was about 14 years older than Jesus. And I believe that, the evidence that I have points to Mary Magdalene being his daughter, and that she married Jesus. And in fact, that Jesus took over John the Baptist's, disciples. In other words, that it was John who was the original leader, and it was, and Jesus took over from him upon marrying his daughter, effectively.
And you also mentioned that you believe, again, don't want to use the believe word too loosely here, but you believe that Mary Magdalene was black. Are you saying that John the Baptist's wife was black, or?
What I think that, first and foremost, black is perhaps the wrong thing. The words that the Greeks would have used would be Ethiopian, which simply means the burnt-faced people. But it was used equally well for the people of the Arabian Peninsula. So the patrons, as far as the Greeks would have been concerned, would have been Ethiopians. And I use the word Ethiopians rather than Ethiopians to distinguish the two. And therefore, black in the sense that she was very dark-skinned, yes, certainly. But equally well, for example, there is an Eastern European tradition that John the Baptist was black. You pays your money and you takes your choice.
What is the evidence that you have that Jesus moved to India with the Apostle Thomas after his zealot / Zadokite revolution failed and he survived his execution?
That is somewhat more difficult. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, it depends, and I haven't said that he did, I said that it's a possibility, okay? Because the Acts of Thomas clearly point to that. And there are supposed to be other documents in Kashmir and Tibet which show that as well. Problem is, A, I have not seen the documents, B, no scholar that I would, should we say, trust without question has actually seen them. Yes, there is a book that's been published which purports to show these documents, but I've got no idea if they are genuine or not. And anyway, very few people can actually read the language that they're written in. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's a question of, yes, it's a possibility. Am I 100% sure of it? No, I'm not. But, you know, that's as most I can do. I mean, I put this in because there are a group of people out there who firmly believe that. So I said, yes, it's a possibility, but that's as far as I would go. And I don't know what the percentage of possibility of that is either.
How does another enigmatic figure that has been mythologized by history and religion, Saul of Tarsus, or Paul as we know him, play into the intrigue of the Jesus dynasty?
Let's have a look, first of all, at Saul of Tarsus. Because in the Gospels, if you like, they call him Saul of Tarsus. But Abdius does not say that. Abdius calls him Saul Tarsensis, and that simply means Saul the Strong. In fact, you get the word Tarzan from the Greek, or from the Aramaic, if you like, which means precisely that. It means simply the strong man. And Abdius doesn't make the point that he came from Tarsus. He was a Benjamite. He's unlikely to have come from Tarsus. He was Saul the Strong. He was a Benjamite who was also a Roman citizen and was in fact a Roman soldier for part of his life. And, for example, when this Roman was going to beat him at some stage or other, was going to flog him, and he lost his temper and said, "How dare you do this? You know, I am a Roman born, you know, I'm more senior in the officer than you are." And so the guy sort of said, "Whoops, dear me, big mistake," and went off and got his superior, and the superior said, "Oh, right, well, we can't run in with you, we've got to get you off to the emperor." This is the Saul, the real Saul. I maintain that Saul married Jesus' daughter, okay? His daughter Mary, or Maria. And by doing that, he took the name Paul. Now, this business about is converting to Christianity and becoming given the name Paul, I think is probably set up to hide what really happened. Because if you have a look at the Greek letters Chi, which is like a sort of St. Andrew's cross with a P coming out of the middle, right? what he was saying by changing his name to Paul was, I am now the spokesperson for Christ. I am now the anointed one. And a bit like, for example, in the Islamic world, where the son-in-law of Muhammad, Ali, I said, no, you people are not the continuations of Muhammad. I am, because I have married his most senior daughter. And that from that came the Shiite movement. So here you have, I think, the same thing happening. And Saul turning round to James and the others and saying, no, I am married to the most senior daughter of the Lord. I am now the head of the church, not you. And I think this is where the big argument came.
And that's how we get the whole mythology of the schism
absolutely.
between the church and Paul. Okay.
Sure. And after all, he was a Benjamite. He'd been a Roman. He was more interested in preaching to the people that he knew rather than keeping it solely amongst the Jews. And this is, I think, where we get it from.
Just to clear with the listener, you talk about the Elven Guard dynasty.
Yep.
Basically, the Elven Guard dynasty is the Jesus line mixed with the Visigoths, right?
Well, strictly speaking, Olvunga, by the way, is not something I invented. It was suggested about 40 or 50 years ago, even 60 years ago. And there are various names for it. For example, in Scandinavia, it's called the Folkunga dynasty or the Yngling dynasty, which Yngling simply means younger, and it's a younger branch of the same dynasty. But literally, it means the people of Ulf, okay? Or the folk of Ulf. And Ulf being Atta Ulf. Now, Atta simply means the father or the ancestor. So Atta Ulf is probably what he was called later on in life, when he'd sort of fathered a dynasty. And just as Ataturk, his real name was Mustafa Kemal, and became known as Ataturk, the father of the Turks. So Atta Ulf became known as the father Ulf. From him descend not just the Visigothic dynasty, but also the Mercian dynasty and one or two others. However, the only one that includes the Davidic dynasty as well is the dynasty which descends from him and Maria. So, if you like, I have used the Olvunga dynasty specifically to mean that one, but it probably isn't, strictly speaking, accurate, because there are other people who descend from him, but don't necessarily descend from Maria.
Moving down in history, and it seemed almost poetic justice for at least a time, but wouldn't the descendants of Jesus return during the Crusades and finally take monarchy over Jerusalem?
Well, this is what I think is the sweetest bit of sort of revenge that you can possibly imagine. Here you had the Roman state and church writing the descendants of Jesus out of the whole of history. And then, in 1095, Pope Urban preaches the First Crusade. However, he didn't just preach it sort of out of the blue. Before he decided to go ahead and preach this crusade, he talked to a few people. He talked, for example, to Admar, Bishop of Le Puy, and to Raymond of Toulouse. And the major magnates, if you like, who were the leaders of the Crusades, were Raymond of Toulouse, Hugh de Vermandois, Robert of Normandy, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Bohemond of Taranto. Every single one of those just happens to be a descendant of the Olvungas. Okay, that's an accident. Twice, it's a coincidence. But crikey, when you got it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times,
yeah,
it started to look, oh my goodness, well, maybe it wasn't quite what we thought it was. And when it finishes up, just after they've actually taken Jerusalem and they've got their first king of Jerusalem in, guess what happens? they managed to get their own Olvunga man in as Pope. Right? Calixtus was an Olvunga. So all of a sudden, you've got them taking over, they've now taken over the whole of the old Roman Empire. They've taken back Jerusalem. They've even got their own man as Pope. The very Pope who sort of wrote them out. And guess what? We're back, boys. It's really quite something. And I think it's too much just to say it's a coincidence.
And they would have control, at least for Jerusalem, for what, 200 years?
Something of the sort, yeah.
And Hugh, what do you think was the real purpose of the Knights Templar?
It is such a contentious issue, this. But in my opinion, the people who started off as the so-called founders of the Knights Templar almost certainly started life in the personal bodyguard of either Baldwin I or Baldwin II, and went with either or both of them from Edessa, which is where they were, to Jerusalem. And I think that they became, if you like, they became an elite force, because the Baldwins realized that the old feudal system wouldn't work anymore, and therefore they needed to have a professional group of fighters who were, if you like, who were directly responsible to them as kings of Jerusalem. Now, unfortunately, I mean, everyone says, well, yes, the Bernard of Clairvaux, etc., was the person who got the Templars up and running. Yes, he was, but I'm not sure he did them any favors, because he got them to change them from having the King of Jerusalem as the head of, if you like, their order, to having the Pope as the head of their order. And by that time, Calixtus was dead. So I don't think that did them any favors at all. But I think that the Knights Templar probably guarded a lot of the areas that the Baldwins, but in particular, wanted searched and looked at and so on. Now, I don't actually think they did any personal digging under the temple. I don't think that any knight would have, bothered to do that. That would have been dirtying his hands. But I think it's very possible that they acted as guards, if you like, to see what was going on and what was found.
So they were not gathering information to support the Jesus line or anything like that.
I don't know. And the truth of the matter is I don't know. I believe that, if anything, most of the documents would have been in the royal archives in Edessa, because that's where the famous letters were supposed to have been between Jesus and King Abgar. That's where it was in Edessa that Jesus' brother or half-brother was for so long. That's where, Thomas's bones were brought, Judas Thomas's bones were brought back from India and buried in Edessa. I think the key to everything is Edessa rather than Jerusalem. But it is very likely, or it is possible, that in Edessa they found information. They thought, well, we may find some more in Jerusalem. But I don't know. And that's, it's a possibility.
And these documents were lost through time, just by...
Well, I'm not sure. I think that some of those documents, or copies of some of those documents, are the documents which survived through the Cathars and what have you, and probably with the Templars, and then, they are in various collections around the world today. And some of those, of course, are the ones which I probably got hold of. But I don't know.
Well, your book definitely puts a lot of evidence, and you also mention, which is also very telling, but didn't the Elven Guards aid the Cathars before and during the Albigensian Crusade?
Yes, they did. No question about that. Because you must remember that the Counts of Toulouse were all Elven, and it was in their lands. And I mean, they in fact opposed the Crusade. to start with, and it wasn't until basically they realized that they were going to lose everything that they did a deal. But by that time, I think any documents, etc., would have been spirited away, and I think certain people within the Cathar community were probably spirited away too. And they were probably hidden by the Templars, I would suspect, or given refuge by the Templars.
And how do you think the Cathars had this information? Do you think it was passed down through the Bogomils, the Manichaeans, and others, or?
Well, you see, the Cathars are a direct descendant of the Elchusites. So, Catharoi was one of the names by which the Elchusites were actually known. And there's very little doubt that the Cathars were a sort of an offshoot, or whatever you want to call it, of the Elchusites. And I think that many of the documents that they had would have been passed on to them by the Elchusites. But, you can't prove that. But it seems reasonable.
And later on, you mention in your book that the Elven Guards also aided in the rise of the Protestant Reformation. Could you explain how this happened?
If you have a look at the big initial Protestant families, both in Germany, in Scotland, in England, Holland, and in particular the Unitarians, if you have a look at them, the names of many of the people associated with the founding of those religions are all old Elven families. And I would suggest that anything which was anti-papacy, anti-Roman Catholicism, would have been supported by them, just in order to counteract as much as possible the effects of the Albigensian Crusade.
And also, wouldn't it be also a little or a lot of resentment towards what the Catholic Church did?
Oh, absolutely.
Enough motivation as it is?
Oh, absolutely, 100%, yes. Very much so.
And lastly, Hugh, where is, or this might be a loaded question, because I'm sure a lot of people were probably wondering, and you have a lot of people running around, in this day and age, claiming lineage to Jesus. How would the one go about finding their lineage to the Elven Guards, or do we know exactly where they are exactly?
Well, first of all, as regards, I would reckon that there must be anywhere between 1.5 to 3 million people who descend from Jesus or one of his brothers and sisters. And the truth of the matter is, even if you did DNA samples, you couldn't prove which was which anyway. So, the butcher down the road may well be a descendant of Jesus. I wouldn't know. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not something that I got terribly worked up about. Because if he wasn't a god, if he was just an ordinary person who was a failed revolutionary, why would you want to go to all the problems of saying, well, I descend from him?
Yeah,
and if he was a god, then you can't have descended from him. They want to have their cake and eat it. And I'm afraid that doesn't go down very well with me.
Right,
so,
it doesn't make you a god.
Yeah, it's a bit silly, isn't it? Either the guy was an ordinary human being who was a failed revolutionary, in which case, why would you particularly want to descend from him? If you say, well, okay, he was, descendant of the Davidic line from Jerusalem, yeah, sure, but there are at least 3 other much better documented descents from the Davidic line of Jerusalem than his. So what's the big deal?
What are these 3 other lineages that are...
Well, there's the Exilarchs of Baghdad, which are known as the Eastern Exilarchs. There was the Exilarchs of the West, which were based in Septimania. And then there's the... Oh, goodness gracious me, what's the other one called now? there was the, I didn't call them exilarchs, what did they call them? I'm trying to think. There was one other one which sort of went back to Jerusalem, and was known, the Nasai of Jerusalem. Those were the three documented, if you like, descendants of David.
And lastly, Hugh, is this trilogy the end of your research on the Jesus lineage, or do you have something else in the works?
No, it's as far as I'm concerned, this trilogy takes it to the point that I wanted to take it to, which was, if you like, the apogee of the Elven Guard dynasty. Yes, I've got ongoing research, but it's not directly related to that. It goes off at various tangents. I mean, I'm looking, for example, at Moses and who Moses might have been, and I'm also looking at things like what happened to the people of the island of Malta. So there's a couple of other things which I'm interested in, but as far as I'm concerned, this trilogy finishes at this point, unless, of course, if some new information suddenly came up or new documents came to light, well, okay, I'll go and have a look at it again.
Yeah, it's the ongoing life of a historian. It never ends.
Absolutely. Yes, you're quite right. It is, I mean, one of the awful things was that we'd actually just got to the point of publishing this third book when some new documents, which I'd been waiting for, trying to get hold of for 2 years, literally came through my door. When I looked at them, I said, "Oh, Lord," and I had to rewrite 2 chapters and put in a totally new appendix just to deal with it.
I think that's about all the time we have. I'd like to thank you very much, Hugh, for
Not
coming on for a very stimulating interview.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and, if anyone wants to come back and you want to have a second interview, I'm more than happy.
That would definitely be a pleasure, and we look forward to more of your research, and good luck with your books.
Thank you very much indeed.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Hugh Montgomery on the God King descendants of Jesus of Nazareth, and mucho más, including some brain fart questions I had. Again, he is the author of the God Kings of Europe, the descendants of Jesus traced through the Davidic dynasties, the God Kings of Outremer, and the God Kings of England. I think a good point Hugh makes is that being a descendant of Jesus, if he ever existed, really amounts to a hill of fava beans and a nice Chianti. So you've got the blood of a failed Messiah turned into a rising dying godman that isn't even as rich as other Davidic lines known in the world. And when it comes down to it, anyone who traces their bloodline sooner or later will run into someone famous, some saint, some royalty, or some historic giant. Big friggin' Walmart deal. I believe that tracing back our spiritual lineage to Seth, the first Gnostic and true son of Eve, also like Mary Magdalene, another avatar of Sophia, and following the tree of life of the Kabbalah that is inside us is what really makes us true royalty, like the prince in the Hymn of the Pearl. But there is nothing wrong with being a failed hero, which in essence is the true greatness of the story of Jesus. And Jesus being a failed hero is questionable, since it's not his death that matters, but his life, his words, an example in an archetypal, mythopoetic way. Most people clamor for heroes in their lives, imagination, or stories, but few want to take the hero's journey into the heart of darkness. We appreciate the Greek or Shakespearean tragedies, but we make sure we are part of the Greek chorus and not the main actors of the college play. Instead of the champion eternal who gives his heart, soul, and eventually life for a greater cause, we lower our heads after putting on the sunglasses of mediocrity. but not at Aeon Byte. We have begun a revolution for the world soul itself. With blood in our mouths, battered by life, haunted by our memories when we were nothing but Stepford humans, we stand wounded but steady against the God of this world. They will soon come for us like they always do in history's eternal holocaust. Soon the crowds will mock and spit at us because of their feckless ignorance. The authorities will break down our doors, and our hearts will be pierced by the swords of intolerance and censorship. Mark my words, this will happen in less than 3 years. So the best thing for you to do is stop listening to Aeon Byte. Forget about Gnosticism and the mystic arts, and go back to those mirrors and their twisted images of you. Because if you don't, then like me, you have already begun to transform yourself in the hero with 1,000 faces, and your ultimate failure will actually be a great victory, even though it may be just a pinprick in the darkness of mankind's mere being, and also a tear in one of the eyes of Sophia. In other words, and strangely so, we will have tasted something so few have tasted before, and true freedom and compassion are part of it. I believe it's worth our own Via Dolorosa to our own personal Golgotha. In the words of the great Ayn Rand, in the name of the best within you, do not sacrifice this world to those who are its worst. In the name of the values that keep you alive, do not let your vision of man be distorted by the ugly, the cowardly, the mindless, and those who have never achieved his title. Do not lose your knowledge that man's proper estate is an upright posture, an intransigent mind, and a step that travels unlimited roads. Do not let your fire go out, sparked by irreplaceable spark, in the hopeless swamps of the approximate, the not quite, the not yet, the not at all. Do not let the hero in your soul perish in lonely frustration for the life you deserved, but have never been able to reach. Check your road and the nature of your battle. The world you desired can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It's yours. I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the God above God that can. The road is ended, the song is over, thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me